welcome to the second installment of my historical exploration series in the graveyard in the massively multiplayer text-based game GemStone III. I'm your host, the player Xorus. In the introduction video, I explained the out-of-game context for this history series. The graveyard is over 30 years old and has layers of hidden meaning. This is partly because GemStone III was set in the now archaic Shadow World history and world setting. There are details in the story and the graveyard that have added sense in that context. I will be calling this paleo-history, since it is history, but restoring an older form of it. For most people playing Gemstone today, the Shadow World setting is very foreign. They may know little bits of it, but not in any great depth, not immersively. Most of it is not even relevant to Gemstone. In the grand scheme of things, the graveyard is set in that world setting, but I don't think it leans very heavily into it. I think the story itself is a bit off-canon for Shadow World and probably has a higher concept in its own terms. In the next video, though, I will explore the deep end, Shadow World with extreme prejudice. What would be true if you went all the way with world logic and internal narrative consistency? This is inherently ironic and contingent because there's no way to know for sure when consistency stops mattering. You just have to explore the possibility space and stress test it for parsimony and probable relevance. In this video, we have to start easier and do orientation with Shadow World. I'll give you the basic context of the graveyard and pluck the low-hanging fruit in terms of its hidden meaning. So, first, to explain my conceptual framework for handling this sort of thing, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes on matters of method. Otherwise, skip ahead to timestamp 22 minutes and 0 seconds. So, those losers are going to miss out on some really cool stuff, but also some math. Totally unnecessary math. When there's a story based on another story, what might be called an urtext, I typically refer to this hidden dimension as subtext or a subtextual layer. Some things like tropes or myths, very meta stuff, might make for valid story analysis by accident. Those interpretations have some value on their own, but they're not what I mean. What I mean is something more overt, self-consciously basing things on some other source material. This has to be more than a loose source of inspiration that might get recognized. Things can look inspired by other sources the creator has never even heard of. What you need usually is having more than just a few elements in common. There has to be enough there to say that as making allusions. In a sense, the world setting of the game is such a text, but we know it was used and have explicit documentation for it. There are things in the graveyard and its backstory that are immediately informed by the world setting. I'll refer to that as context, since it is explicit and we know it's there. This paleo-history is only missing context because the urtext of the Shadow World setting is unfamiliar to most players. Imagine if you were looking at Atlanthea without the supporting documentation. It's exactly the same thing, except for the Ice Age parts of Gemstone. Context becomes explicit meaning as soon as it's recognized. There's no need for speculative reasoning. There's the possibility of deeper hidden meaning, things being implied, irony, symbolism, what might also be intended. In other words, the subtext is a kind of parallel, and at some point the parallel breaks down. This is true even for the world setting, which only applies up to a point. Beyond a certain level of scrutiny, even official documentation is not consistent with itself, and you have to stop pulling the thread, or it all unravels. When there's a parallel to some other source material, a hidden urtext, we might say the thing has an allegorical interpretation. In the same way that the world logic breaks down under too much scrutiny, this sort of parallel will also break down if you push it too far. It is impossible to prove such a pattern is intentional, strictly speaking, but you can be almost certain it's really there in some cases. The idea is to come up with something you can't dismiss, that you're forced to concede might really be true, so that even if the theory turns out to be wrong, it wasn't ridiculous. That is, it was a good theory while it lasted, it just happened to not be right. There's also the possibility of a higher concept, a grand design that unifies the whole thing. Of course, you can come up with an ingenious theory that sounds like it cannot possibly be wrong, but the whole thing turns out to be a pure and total accident. In an ideal world, you would have the game masters who made something say, at some point, what was really going on with the stuff they created. This would be the gold standard. Sometimes we're lucky and have this, either partially or substantially. Often we're not so fortunate, and there's no choice but to guess, weighing and killing possibilities. Much of the game has no hidden depth. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. With the graveyard, I do not know who exactly was involved in making what things. These were presumably staff members carried over from GemStone II. I would probably recognize the names if I saw them, but I do not know which ones. I'm given to understand that there are often signatures under the hood on early GemStone developments. There are also lots of old rooms inaccessible from the rest of the game, just floating in the ether. Sometimes previous versions of existing places disconnected rather than erased. But having never been a GM, I can't see any of that. So we're stuck with trying to figure it all out on the player side, hence this video series. We have two kinds of meaning in general, explicit and implicit. They come to us in two broad categories, fixed and transient. Fixed elements are things that are mostly unchanging. Lore documents, room painting, permanent objects. Transients are things that are only temporary. Storylines, NPC interactions, museum objects. This could also include fixed things like game mechanics or messaging that gets removed. In a sense, it could include any glitch in the matrix. Anytime the agents change something and the original is not recorded or otherwise gets forgotten. I'm like the Merovingian. I collect things from prior versions of the Matrix. I would enjoy swearing in French if I were fluent in French. Transients are only as good as how well recorded they are, and they're often recorded badly or not at all. It would also include intermittent things like lore songs and objects with impermanent presence, items that come and go with characters. Implicit meaning with fixed elements are often known unknowns, but transients can easily introduce unknown unknowns. That is, things we're aware we don't know versus things we're not even aware that we don't know. While explicit fixed meanings can get retconned, it's relatively easy to avoid doing it by accident. It's very difficult to avoid contradicting implicit meanings over the long run, and almost impossible to keep everything consistent with transients. So, some concrete examples. Some parts of the game have fixed explicit backstories in the form of lore documents. These include the Graveyard, Heretic's Reach, now called Melgarin's Reach, the Broken Lands, Shadow Valley. With the exception of the Shadow Valley story, which is still treated as an official document, all of those I just said are archaic. They're not entirely untrue now per se. Some of it has been reaffirmed later. Uthex from the Broken Lands story, for example, was used as the premise for the cleric's self-resurrection spell, Miracle. These old place name documents just have some stuff in them that doesn't translate well. Though there are other places, like Goblin's Garden, that have their own documents. Sometimes there's backstory in the form of fixed game objects. This could take the form of NPC journals, like in the Waterward area of River's Rest or the Vesperti area in Foggy Valley. Other places tell a story through permanent ambient messaging. The Wolves Den does this, so does Bone Spear Tower. This has an implicit aspect in that you still have to put it all together, but it reaches out and smacks you in the face saying, "Hey, there's some backstory going on over here." Permanent objects with lore songs also provide fixed explicit meaning. These exist in various places, though not Ice Age places. Bards were really underdeveloped for a very long time. What are examples of fixed implicit meaning? One thing, as I just said, is piecing together those flashbacks. Another would be a story being implied by considering all the room details. That would be an example of context. One example would be the underground stronghold on the coastal cliffs in the Severed Head. Some of the stuff can be subtle and you might be tricking yourself. Rooms might just be generally evocative of a basic premise. Another would be if there is a higher concept that can be figured out by such details, which would be an example of subtext. Evis's temple, the Viper Shroud, or Ibis if you prefer, was built in the shape of certain parts of female anatomy. No, I'm not making that up. That's intentional. That's really what it's supposed to be. It was confirmed by its creator, former GM Eranth. People have actually figured that out before, too. Sometimes a cigar is not just a cigar. Evis's temple was also based on Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom, which you can figure out if you're familiar enough with the Khmer Empire, or maybe if you've just played a lot of Civ. There was also some inspiration from Lovecraft, with words like cyclopean, unspeakable, madness, and nightmares spawned of a diseased fancy. What would be an example of wrong implicit meaning? Something that sounds convincing, but totally unintentional. In the case of Evis's temple, Evis is holding a large ruby with a stylized flame, which is actually Eergina's symbol. Some people believe this is an homage to the idea that Evis and Eergina were lovers. This is found on player websites from the late 90s. It has been erroneously considered an ICE concept. Orgiana and Enis actually hate each other. Dark Gods and Shadowworld regard each other as rivals, though that was not stated explicitly until much later Shadowworld books. Notwithstanding anything that might have happened in-game in, say, 1995, mind you, which, as I said, is very badly recorded. Former GM Fawn, who was the product manager for a long time, did a lot of RP involving the gods back then. But someone might put together that the ice form of Evis had 4 arms like the Hindu goddess Kali, and her focus was dancing, which was actually removed from her modern description. And then notice the Viper Shroud Temple has a hall of dancers, and Angkor Wat was originally a Hindu temple. It's a very thin premise, but it's seductive, and it could be right. But it's not. In this case, it's a total coincidence. Evis holding the symbol of Eergina is nothing more than a typo. It was supposed to be the Evis symbol. There's nothing more going on there. But here's the thing. What if that had been intended by the creator? It would look exactly the same as it does now. This raises the issue of things that actually exist versus what was planned or intended, which, strictly speaking, does not exist. Take, for example, the Of Krovan and Reavers document. The Krovan only fear the Sea Elf pirates who predate on them. One might infer these are Ashrim descendants. GM scribes intended them to be Ashrim descendants. There's a forum post where he actually says it, but the document itself does not say it. That sort of intent has weight when a GM is still on staff, but can quickly evaporate when they are no longer there to object. It could easily get retconned by a future GM. Current GMs outrank former GMs, after all. Maybe there will be elves on other continents, for example, who are totally unrelated to the houses. Who knows? It's an ongoing work of collaborative fiction with changing gatekeepers. Since this was the gold standard of a GM stating their intent while they were still on staff, maybe such a retcon can be avoided. What about the portal from when the Elotroi arrived? That was never really explained. Former GM Banthus intended the portal to have been left open by Estrion and Ciaro, who had tried to take over the world in the mid-90s out of what is now called Darkstone Castle, and their arrangement with the Caramon Hive Queen, who ended up losing her control over the Elotroi. The Elotroi then flee through the portal. It would have required some conceits or retconning, since Estrion was supposed to be dead. This is not actually stated anywhere, and Estrion has since been treated as still dead. The deal was made once about a decade ago with his ghost to help put some wardings over the landing. So, long story short, the author's intent does not actually exist in the text of what they created. You might be able to reconstruct the intent if there's enough to go on, but not completely and certainly not uniquely. With only the fixed information at hand, more than one interpretation can fit it, and an unintended one might sound very convincing. In the philosophy of science, this is called the problem of underdetermination. For any finite amount of data, there are an infinite number of theories that fit it. It is having more information that eliminates them. Think of some dots that can be fitted with a straight line, but also a sine wave or a polynomial, or even random squiggly lines. The straight line and the sine wave say very different things, but they might both in some sense be right, and the just so polynomial may only be coincidental because it happens to just be the right order to fit the data points. If you could get another equally spaced data point, the polynomial would be falsified, but the sine wave and straight line would survive it. Suppose the author, let's say God for the sake of argument, intended them to be sine wave inflection points. But there is no sine wave, only points, and the straight line fits the points just as well. And there's a deeper reason, independently in their relation to each other, why they both work, since the line intersects those points of inflection. Even though it was unintended, it is true independently of intent. If you're constrained to only making measurements on that periodicity, the two formulations are equivalent, and the stuff in between is dismissed as unphysical since it is unobservable. Physicists would do that anyway. Mathematicians would grumble about it. But the line and the sine wave in this situation are not real. The only things that are real are the dots. Those functions are theories for predicting and explaining the dots. This is what I mean when I say the author's intent does not actually exist in the story. It is not uniquely correct if it exists, but we still want to know it. The random squiggly lines are ad hoc, like seeing shapes in clouds or hidden patterns in television static. This is how you convince yourself that ancient aliens built the pyramids, and were probably shapeshifters who were possessed by ghosts. We can't know the ancient aliens were not shapeshifters after all, but if they were, for all we know, they could have been possessed. There are words for it: apophenia, confirmation bias. I try to avoid being the ancient aliens guy. What are examples of transients? Storylines in general. The Vrael quest is related to Castle Anwin, Mount Einatungana, and the Rift. Expanded background information might be spoken by NPCs. This happened, for example, when the Red Force was released. There were release events and NPCs for Shadow Valley. That is badly recorded now. Bone Spear, the spear of the Dwarven Necromancer of Bone Spear Tower, appeared at least 3 separate times. There are mostly only player summaries of this, which isn't good enough to tell if, for example, what Bone Spear says should be trusted. What about transient implicit meaning? One thing would be any sort of irony, like if an NPC was an unreliable narrator, or if the messaging that happened in an event or the invasion creatures or so on were an allusion to something. Another would be that Bone Spear wants to bind the tower into a huge misshapen sword. Last I knew, this sword was possessed by True Killer, and the tower still seems possessed. There's some subtext here because the tower demon is Malaskari, the demon lord of death and undeath. There was a sword from the Ice Age with a demon imprisoned in it that claimed to serve Malaskari. It passed through the hands of several players. The last person I'm aware having it was Kree. Without the surviving records of player summaries, newsletters, and so on, something very subtle like this would be totally missed. Though, for all I know, there were more incidents involving the tower in Bone Spear which I have never heard. Bone Spear Tower is a memorial for GM Kygar, whose character was a dwarf. There's also a pub named after him in Dragon Realms. Kygar made the original parts of the Broken Lands and most of what's now called the Lycerian Hills, not including the Castle Anwin parts, among other things. Krolvin, the original BCS system, the early parts of Terrace Isle, and so on. He was also CRL. I never met Kygar, but I would have had 1,000 questions. With implicit meaning, there are three tiers of clarity. The highest is when there is an irrefutable pattern of references. The Rift, for example, is heavily based on tarot cards. The creatures in the Rift are also largely named in Latin. The bottom tier are one-offs, things that might be Easter eggs or inside jokes by the creator. There's a rumor that the Broken Lands, for example, was named after the Broken Land Parkway near the old Simultronics headquarters in Maryland. Something like that has to be verified from hearing it from a relevant GM. There's no way to tell something like that as coincidence. The signal can't be separated from the noise when coincidences sound as convincing as the actual event. The story for the Broken Lands, for what it's worth, was originally titled The Broken Land, singular, not plural. Then there are the between cases where the perceived references may or may not be really there in the sense of the authorial intent. Trying to guess such things comes with the hazard of a former GM being able to turn up at any time and saying, "Oh, I made that. You are completely wrong. That's not it at all." What I would call a Marshall McLuhan moment of clarity. In practice, it'll be more likely to be only partly right, but if you can't be right, you might as well find a brilliant way to be wrong. That all being said, we have very little in the way of transients for the original parts of the graveyard, and in this video we will focus on restoring the fixed explicit context to pluck the low-hanging fruit. In later videos I will explore the fixed implicit aspects, the subtext, and construct a theory for the higher concept. Welcome back if you skipped my discourse on method. There was math. Look, I never said there would be no math, okay? Beware, mortals. So, the graveyard was built by Bandar Atrivian, the ruler of a theocracy in homage to Empress Catina, who was dead for the past 100,000 years. Cadeina is also a correct pronunciation. The Emer book from 1990 defines a lot of the pronunciations using phonetic notation. Empress Catina does not exist in the history of Valanthia. There's nothing truly analogous to her in GemStone's modern world setting. Most Ice Age gods are very similar to their modern forms, so similar it is extremely easy to read anachronisms into them. Gaucina and Cadina are very different, at least for Cadina as she exists in canonical Shadow World. Empress Cadina was not actually a goddess, though there's a line in the Master Atlas that says she styled herself as an Empress Goddess. Cadina was the ruler of an immortal, except for death by violence, race of powerful humanoids called the Lords of Essence. The Master Atlas is very explicit in its deity section that an Essence Lord might impersonate being a god, but they are not gods. Empress Cadina was decapitated by her cousin Uther. In the Shadow World timeline, there are three eras, and the huge dark ages between the first and second era called the Interregnum. Like the Atlantean history, this has the basic Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion construction of ages. Age of gods, age of elves, age of men. Wars of darkness separate the ages. There's a superficial similarity between the world settings, mostly for that reason. Lords of Essence ruled Chalthea in the First Era until they destroyed themselves in the Civil War 113,000 years ago. The world was badly damaged and it took a very long time before there was civilization again. The Interregnum lasted for about 100,000 years. The Second Era begins with one of Cadina's surviving cousins, Andrax, pretending to be Elven and founding an order called the Rolemaster. The Second Era lasts about 6,500 years until the forces of darkness rise up in the Wars of Dominion. In the 1989 books, these are characterized as forces of the unlife, while from 1990 onward it was driven by the Dark Gods. Wars of Dominion lasted 375 years, and that ended the Second Era. The Third Era is when Shadow World is set now. The year was 6050 Third Era in the 1989 books. Kelfor's Landing was founded in 6025's Third Era. It's only 25 years old. Kelfor's Landing is also very small, about the size of the field I had to run laps around when I was in middle school. about 10 football fields put together. Bander and Catch-Atravion joined the forces of Neon Life early in the Wars of Dominion. This would have been roughly 6,400 years ago. Calthea has a 350-day lunar calendar, but 25-hour days, so 1 year still works out to 365 Earth days. So on the scale of years, at least, it's all the same and translates. At some point in the Wars of Dominion, refugees from eastern Jaimon are fleeing forces of Neon Life and establish a citadel called Kelburn. This lasts about 6,000 years, and the region is known as Kelborn. It was not called Kelborn yet in the Second Era. In other words, it would not have been called that in the time of Bander or when Lau the Enchanter built what we call Melgren's Reach. I'm not sure why they renamed the reach after Melgren. Melgren was an evil warlock and mad inventor who was a lot older than he looked. He built a steam-powered Dragon skyship, which was a quest back in the Ice Age, and he also had a tower people would raid. If Melgren and Lau the Enchanter were the same person, I'm not familiar with that story. Though I did hear someone say once the mountain grew from Melgren's footstool, which is something he had in his Dragon skyship, but I assume that was a joke. But digression aside, Kelburn fell 210 years ago. The Spider Temple was founded by refugees of Kelburn. Kelburn, as you can see, is on the high plateau. It was actually built at one point, and after the de-ice was moved way to the south. Kelburn is the citadel in River's Rest. It's called the Kingdom of Alaneth now. Something weird happened with Alaneth. Kelborn and Kelburn were both changed to the word Alaneth, but then Alaneth came to be the word used for the game's whole continent. Kelborn is the northwest corner of the continent Jaimon, which was changed to the word Jantara and still used in a few places. Notice the original maps had distance scales. The landing region is larger than the state of New York. There used to be hard RT messaging saying it was taking days when you walk to Cavern Hold. Our characters walk at supersonic speeds, except when we have to deal with gnolls. As of 2019, this inconsistency was fixed, so Alaneth, except for the vestigial River's Rest case, refers to the main continental mass, and Jantara is the mainland plus the surrounding land masses, such as Atanarith and the Shattered Continent. Think of it like Australia versus Australasia or Oceania. It's just that this is a retcon and not quite what it meant in very old stuff. The territory of Bander and Catch-Atravion was the western shoreline of Gladesbrim Bay up to the windward edge of the high plateau. Gladesbrim Bay was the original name of Darkstone Bay. Gladesbrim and all the regional place names are made up of Sealtang words. Sealtang is a local trader's language used in Kelfor's Landing. It's a pidgin dialect. Many of its words are just contractions. Sma means small, for example, so Smatoth is literally small mountain. Blow means blown or windy, so Blowtoth is windy mountain, because it's very windy up there on Glatoth. Blowtoth, by the way, is the volcano, not the glacier. The glacier doesn't exist in canonical Shadow World. Maybe the Gla in Glatoth was supposed to imply glacier. I have no idea, but it sounds plausible. These were probably not the place names used by Kelburn 200 years ago, and certainly not 6,000 years ago in the Wars of Dominion. The granite for the crypt came from the High Plateau, which is interesting because the High Plateau is actually made out of limestone. I'll tell you now that this will be a recurring theme throughout this historical series. Most everything with the graveyard is backwards or wrong in some way. The High Plateau is an anomaly. It's still mentioned by name in the graveyard, and it still exists in a few spots. The Colossus is almost certainly on the High Plateau. The Colossus was made sometime before 1996. Except the High Plateau is not on any of the maps of the Darkstone Bay region. Not even that the name was changed to something else. It's just not there. I love geographical contradictions and anomalies. Zeltoth exists in two different places because Liftoth and Hetoth were both changed to Zeltoth. There's room painting explicitly saying the glacier on Glatov is tiny and the conditions for a glacier being there are all wrong. There's some indication it might have been made artificially by Melgren. Maybe he made the steel golems. It's on the rumors section of the Play.net website for that area. The ravine by the citadel would have been the Colwaither River, which became the Locksmere, but in Gemstone that river passes through the landing. This is because of a contradiction between the maps and the text of the Kelborn sourcebook. The Kelfor landing map is labeled Colwaither River, but the river is actually called the River Rame, named after Rame Kelfor. Its source is probably an undiscovered mountain lake in the Dragon's Fang Mountains called the Keltarn. The Colwaither River doesn't come anywhere near Kelfor's landing. But anyway, back on topic. The Lycerian Hills, originally called the Sealfar Strake, was shifted south to where there's supposed to be high plateaus, and Glatov was moved way north. The northern side of Darkstone Bay is pretty much undefined now as a result. The Placid Monk and the monk in the Landing Temple were from up there near Fjortoth, and that part of the northern peninsula no longer exists. Though there were conversion terms for the mountains up there, I've never actually seen any of those words used in the game itself. Fjortoth is supposedly Startoth, Galtoth is Keltoth, Straketoth is Straketoth. I'm not saying it's intentional, but I like to think of the high plateau as Lovecraft's dreaded Plateau of Leng, which exists or does not exist in multiple places. The graveyard is located on the edge of the high plateau. It's actually quite far away, much closer to Blototh, now called Glatov, than it is to Kelfor's Landing. The forest maze, after all, is unnatural. This is established both by just looking at the plateau from the graveyard and by the story, which says it was built on the northern marches. Interestingly, the story says the graveyard is enclosed, with the burial mound forming the northern perimeter. But the northern perimeter of the graveyard is not enclosed at all. The vast plateau goes out to the horizon. Ironically then, in spite of the huge gate and all that, it seems like you could just walk around it. While that is wrong, I do not think it is a mistake, as you will see later. So, that's the basic geography of the story. I will go deeper into it in the next video. Geography and math. I'm putting everyone to sleep. Moving on, the next part of the story talks about Bander having written famous books on the Unlife, which gave him access to restricted artifacts. He was recognized by the college at Carillon for this work, which was the headquarters of the Loremasters, founded by Cadina's cousin Andrax. It was located on a hidden island west of Emer, which was the continent just south of Jaimon. Emer was de-iced as Finia, and that word stopped getting used for many years. Finia will now be the setting for the upcoming new player experience system. It will still be the continent to the south of ours. It will have a floating city called Fion, which I suspect will be an homage to Eidolon and Emer. The Warmasters were the ones who were leading the fight against the forces of the Unlife in the Wars of Dominion. Recall that Bander and Castor were serving those very forces of the Unlife. Bander was also permitted unlimited access to the library at Namikos to continue his research because of his written works. The Library of Namikos was an independent research institution located on the Isle of Ormion off the southern coast of Jaimon. Namikos actually means library in one of the Elven languages, so it's redundant, like saying Sahara Desert. But that wasn't established until much later Shadow World books. These words were changed in Gemstone to the Library of Biblia and the Isle of Ornath, and then they were mostly dropped, though Namikos might have also been inconsistently changed to Nantu. I'm not sure. The Isle of Ornath is now the location of the Rings of Luminous Pay event, and they will probably build the Library of Biblia at some point. Strictly speaking, these are replacement concepts, but there are sometimes homages to their ice origins. I'll talk more about the Library of Namikos later. The point is that it is absolutely unheard of for anyone to have unlimited access to the Library of Namikos. There are special sections that only the scribes of Namikos are allowed to enter. Bender attempted to steal a rare speaking crystal from one of the vaults and was captured by the library guards, unarmed mercenary monks called Shangrimai, who hired themselves out as bodyguards. This is implicitly a Lord of Essence speaking crystal, a relic from over 100,000 years ago that stores information. There's an excerpt in the Master Atlas from 1989 that quotes a speaking crystal at Namagos. This is the only reference to Namagos having one of them. Though the Jaimon book from 1989 does say Namagos uses advanced technology in its vaults for preserving its ancient texts, and it makes sense it could have one of them. Andrax was the founder of the Library of Namagos as well, and was a surviving Lord of Essence himself. It's entirely possible he founded the library on top of a more ancient Lord of Essence facility. In the 1990 books onwards, the speaking crystals are just voice interfaces for their vaults. Taking one from its vault would be pointless. One of the major differences with Shadow World is that it is partly a science fiction setting of the lost ancient civilization kind. You can be doing your wizardry against dragons and all that, and suddenly come across a highly advanced Omega drone with blasters and lasers. Lords of Essence, at least from 1989 onward, when they were identified with the Kitavir raised from I.C.E.'s Space Master books, were very highly technologically advanced, a galactic empire, and some of their technology survives on Calthea in often broken or sometimes still working forms. The speaking crystals are not magical artifacts, they are voice interface databases, computers. In the 1990 books onward, they might even have an avatar that does the speaking, a holographic projection that appears to answer questions. Irak, who we call Eonak, also had a transparent mask of what we call glace, with an overlaid digital display, revealing the properties of items to him. He made a staff for the god we call Tonus, called the Staff of Remembering, that records messages and produces holograms. There was another supercomputer, this one in a downed alien spaceship, that was an artificial intelligence called the Oracle. Yes, I know. Sometimes it really is ancient aliens. Newsletters from 1994 actually mention characters getting brought to the Oracle once, way to the east of Jaimon, or told them things that could discern about the properties of their items. This newsletter is later than the Calfor edition. These were made in a proprietary ebook format, sort of like PDFs with .dp file extensions. You had to install and run a Windows program called Common Ground Viewer to open them. These are on the wiki now as PDFs. It was a huge pain getting all of them converted into PDFs. There's no way to do it directly. I had to emulate an old version of Windows and then take multiple screenshots of every single page. And I glued all the images together and OCR'd it to make searchable text. Fortunately, the installer for it was captured by the Wayback Machine. Otherwise, I would have had to look through my old computers to find it. Volume 2, Issue 1 of the Calthea Chronicle from 1995 only exists in plain text. I found it on Alanka Dunn's website. I'm not sure if we have missing newsletters from 1995. I've never seen them if they exist. Anyway, now that I've blown your mind with the space aliens and AIs, we can move on and take a look at some of the weird stuff about Empress Cadena. First of all, Empress Cadena has been dead for 100,000 years. The Bander pledged himself to her. The story says she was the first Lord of Orhan to follow the ways of the Unlife. These are now called the Lords of Liabo. Empress Cadena has absolutely nothing to do with them in canonical Shadow World. This is implying she was a goddess and was the first to follow the Unlife, implying there were also others. Now, remember what I said about the Dark Gods in the first video. The Dark God pantheon we now call Lornon did not exist yet in 1989. So that is the first point that helps clarify this notion of her having a faction of fallen gods. This is also not merely a typo, it's preserving a typo, which appears in the adventure modules from 1989. I'll explain that issue in the third video. Next, he called his theocracy the Dark Path, which probably comes from a section in the Master Atlas about using evil spell lists, which gradually corrupt the caster who's tapping what they think is a new source of power until they are utterly enslaved by the Unlife. Kadena Thrak Farak means Kadena, guardian of the forbidden in Heretic, which was the dead language of the Lords of Essence. Whatever this means is off-canon, idiosyncratic to Gemstone, and can only be speculated. The story calls it an Ilyarian phrase. It is not Ilyarian, the High Elves. It is Heretic. The founding Rolemaster were Ilyari. There are other possibilities, but I would guess it's supposed to be backwards. That is, an inversion from that point. I will explain that as well in the third video. There was no glossary for Heretic yet in 1989, though some word parts were known from the ocean and land names. It actually says there that common people, like Bander and Kestrel, would not have been familiar with any of that. It is very, very weird that Bander knew anything about Heretic or Empress Kadena. This is probably another point that is willfully wrong. The genteel facade of prayer is not like Empress Kadena at all. She was a world destroyer. This may be idiosyncratic to his death cult theology. That subjects of the kingdom were urged to join the cult to avoid being beheaded is implicitly because Empress Kadena was herself beheaded. Later in the story, when Kestrel returned to discover he was usurped, Bander slew him with a spell of absolution pure. Absolution spells are instant death effects, acts of will with warding rolls versus level. The closest analog today would be the Sorcerer's Sacrifice ability. It's not quite the same thing. GM Warden invented Sacrifice, inspired by a Babylon 5 episode. Absolution Pure rips the soul out permanently instead of temporarily. Only a high-level resurrection spell can fix it. Those are the main points of out-of-context material in the Legend of the Necropolis of Atrovion story. There are other things in the graveyard itself, so I will do a brief walkthrough. I'll be looking at these rooms much more deeply in the later videos, but this will just be plucking some of the low-hanging fruit. To keep the file size down, I will use still images instead of screencasting. First, there's the forest maze, the gloomy woods. I wrote a script a while ago called Ice Mode that converts everything in the game back into its Ice Age terminology. This says lower Trollfang now. The lower and upper designators refer, I believe, to relative elevation. The parts that are closer to the mountains are the upper regions. Lower regions are closer to the bay. The Dragon's Fang further west, now called Dragon's Claw, referred to the several Cowl's Fang mountains closest to Kelfor's Landing. That's because the two outside mountains are taller than the two mountains between them. Dragon's Fang is still referenced in one spot. This forest is lower Cowl's Fang instead of lower Dragon's Fang, implying it is further east, closer to the high plateau. Here there are the Dirge of Vaon vines, originally called Creeping Widowwort. It's a poisonous vine from the Kelborn source book that is indigenous to this region. It will inflict poison if it hits you. As you'll see, most of the plants in places associated with this story were dangerous. It's just overt with these vines. Then there is the Graveyard Gate. There's a lot to say about this thing. I will only cover some of it right now. If you were only familiar with Shadow World and saw I.C.E and Empress Kadena decorated together, it would make absolutely no sense. I.C.E, or I.C.E, like Isis, that's actually the official pronunciation, is the goddess we call Rolemaster now. Kadena was changed to Gosina, but Gosina was left undefined for a few years. There was no pantheon of neutrality originally. We're biased because much later, in the late 1990s, Gosina was made into a goddess who resides on the other side of Rolemaster's Gate. Since the first version of the post-Ice Gods document was written, maybe in late 96 or early 97, I'm not certain exactly when it was released. This has been known since then as the Ebon Gate. In the Ice Age, it was called the Gates of Oblivion. It was a portal to some other dimension left undefined at the time, located on the moon Orhan, which is now called Liabo. Empress Kadena has absolutely nothing to do with the Gates of Oblivion, or Death Religion, or I.C.E and canonical Shadow World. The Staff of Doom is an artifact I.C.E uses to move souls around. It never appears explicitly in the death mechanics messaging, but she was implicitly using it when you get reincarnated after decaying. All of the gods had artifacts like this. Some of them are still represented in the game, especially the Order of Rolemaster, where there's also a depiction of the Staff of Doom. It just isn't named. Which was originally the Order of Vault, of course. The way the gods are depicted along the Landings Monastery's Path of Enlightenment is archaic, notwithstanding anything they might have changed when they did the Vuln review. I haven't sent a character up it in decades. I'll not get into the symbolism of the gate in this video, but the Phantom Gatekeeper is a mocking imitation of I.C.E. There's some really subtle stuff about this gate, things that are staring you in the face, but it does not explicitly tell you it. First, the grotesque statue of Empress Kadena and the cast likeness of I.C.E are part of the gate itself. It is solid bronze, like Rodin's Gates of Hell sculptures, which was loosely inspired by Dante's Inferno. When people jump over the graveyard gate, you only hear a thud from the other side. You can't see through the gate. It's one solid piece until further up. When those Rodin sculptures are exposed to the elements, they turn dark and acquire green patina from the corrosion. They weigh about 10 tons. You can't tell from this picture, but it's 20 feet tall, about 13 feet wide and a few feet thick. This is the one at the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. It has a thinker statue in front of it. The thing is huge. So if the graveyard gate has similar dimensions, that's why it takes several people pushing it. The hinges are made out of iron instead of bronze, which rusts red instead of green. This difference is actually accounted for in the descriptions. With the coefficient of friction for corroded iron on bronze, I calculated that pushing near the center, several adult men probably could exert enough torque to budge it. When you climb up, the messaging implies it has some sharp grill work, at least higher up on it. The top is lined with vertical iron rods, which cut you if you fail to jump. If you were actually looking at the graveyard gate, then it would be dark with some green corrosion. At the top of it would be many spikes of rusted iron. So the gate would look like the top is in flames. Then, when the gate is blasted open magically, the hinges are iron, and this throws off a blizzard of flakes of red rust, which is probably supposed to look like a flame burst. The details for this are all right there. Today, this would have been written to be drenched in ornate language, spelling it all out for you, with fancy words like incarnadine flames. But some of these very old areas, even though they sometimes outright tell you what you are thinking and feeling, which is considered bad form by contemporary standards, have some really implicit stuff in them sometimes. But that's in contrast to rooms that say things like, you've heard there are rock slides in these parts, or the most notorious one of all, the dwarven runes you remember from childhood on the Reach that you recognize as the dead language of Vestnot. I'm not sure if Vestnot is an original or de-ice term. You'd have to ask Bardon. Now, moving into the graveyard, we walk past the crypt. Notice the word unlife. That was unchanged. In several places, unlife was changed to chaos, but it was not changed in this room. Maybe because onslaughts of chaos throughout the chaotic history would sound ridiculous. The up direction here is very, very recent, possibly within the past few months. Certainly 2020 at the earliest. It's not in my logs from late 2019. It's old enough to be on the current instance of the test server, but that doesn't say much. That's only from mid-February, just after the start of Duskrun. What I think happened is that this is probably a very old room that always existed, but was disconnected from the rest of the graveyard, and people were landing up there randomly when exiting the confluence. This sort of accident happens sometimes with changes involving transport effects. It was possible to enter the ruined version of the abandoned inn with temporal rifts for a little while after they restored it 20 years ago. I'm told someone also had a child rescue bounty from the Adventurers Guild where the kid was up on the crypt roof and stuck. So they probably put in an up-down direction so people could get in and out of that room. Necessity being the mother of invention. So we'll assume the roof of the crypt is one of the original rooms and that those are Gorkrow nests. The mist might be because Kelborn, the land of the silver mist, is very foggy in general, but I think it's supposed to be a symptom of the crypt being a greater essence focus. The shadows enclosing it on all sides is unnatural, as that should be determined by the sun's position, and this weirdness with the sun is hinted at on the ground level to the northeast. The wisps of energy and the altar here are related to the Shadow Dragon quest. That's from 2004 with the death mechanics changes introducing death stings, so those don't mean anything. In the shadows of the crypt is some deadly milk white trumpet. This is likely based on angel trumpet related to deadly nightshade. Deadly milk white trumpet in the Shadow World Inhabitants Guide from 1989 grows in the shadows of evil strongholds. The pollen will cause about a week of nausea and blindness or induce madness if you get hit badly with it. The black seeds in midfall cause euphoria and false surety in battle that will likely get you killed. The thorny shrubbery around here is consistent with the high plateau. Further north on the burial mound are Salarissa flowers. So, milk white trumpet is one of those plants that is undefined in the Flora Guide from 2002. My understanding is that document was made by GMs Teleri, Andraste, and Jara. Some of the plants that exist in the Ice Age, a handful of trees and the herbs, were kept consistent with their Rolemaster origins. The document even lists the archaic terminology for them, which once appeared in the now defunct shift verb. The shift verb was eventually removed, I'm told, because people were trying to trick merchants into giving them illegal alterations with it. But some of the more obscure ice terminology slipped through the cracks and did not get changed. So Salarissa is an unchanged ice term, but its meaning got retconned in the Atlantean Flora Guide. In the original lore, Salarissa released a toxic pollen in the spring that could kill large animals, so the burial mound itself is very lethal to trespassers. In the modern lore, it instead has a honey-like fragrance and is used for potpourri after being dried out. Then in the bog are siren flowers. This is something of an anomaly. Siren flower was actually changed to morn blooms. They make a mournful sound caused by the breeze hitting them. But siren flowers still exist in the game, as you can see here, so the meaning of the word was retconned. It has a shrim lore now and is related to Gestev and prophecy. In the original version, it would grow in the wild and was often found next to graveyards and ancient battlegrounds. The bog is implicitly in the spot where the battle took place that Kestrel fought off with demons using his amulet of summoning that Bander made for him. This is implied by the graves there, which have writing in some long-forgotten script, and the death dirges have always worn visored helms. Further up by the fallen trees, which caused the bog to form, are spinewood shrubs. This is another ice term that was overlooked and was retconned later. In the modern lore, it is a tree with segmented trunks resembling spines. In the original lore, the spines were a coat of fine downy hairs on the twigs and leaves. These were extremely sharp and would cause a extensive burning rash and muscle contractions. It would blind you if you got some in your eyes, and breathing in the spines would cause death by suffocation. The creatures all had background material in the Inhabitants Guide and the Rolemaster Creatures and Treasures books as well. Ghouls were caused by being scratched by ghoul nails, which inflicted a transformation disease curse called ghoul rot. The mindless rotting corpse sorts of undead in Rolemaster were typically created in this kind of way. Red rot in the original History of Atlantia document was undefined. It was treated as a respiratory illness and cured by dwarven alchemists in the 2003 War of Nations storyline. Though this was before the alchemy system was released, that was curing a different disease in the 2007 Revenge of the Kiramon storyline. Ironically, Rolemaster zombies did not come from the zombie bite trope. They were instead caused by burial in dark and corrupted lands. The difference between lesser and greater ghouls was just time, and it would mindlessly obey ghoul kings, now called ghoul masters. Ghoul kings, unlike ghouls, were intelligent. The ghouls are implicitly grave robbers, people who broke into the graveyard to plunder and became part of the graveyard. The gore crow on the burial mound isn't a copyrighted term per se, it's just an old word for a large carrion crow. But gore crows in the Rolemaster bestiaries are used as familiars by evil spellcasters. The ghoul masters are probably using the gore crows to scout for trespassers to send ghouls after them. Ghouls also slumber in the muck of swamps, that's why there are ghouls in the bog. The top of the burial mound with the gore crow nest and the ghoul kings was the only on top of the burial mound room originally. Everything else past it, down through the albino tomb spiders, was added in 1998. You were able to exit but not enter the burial mound to that room through the chimney, which is an odd thing to have in a burial mound, and I'll bring that up later. Phantoms in the 1989 books are spirits who have no awareness of their condition or memory of their past lives. I will argue in later videos that the phantoms are probably there for symbolic reasons. Goblins make tunnels. This might be implying the existence of underground tunnels, which we all know, but strictly speaking, they're hidden. The goblins match their Rolemaster description, though they're supposed to be wearing clumsy stone clogs. That's what they're kicking you in the kneecap with, not these boots in the artist rendering. Hobgoblins look like they were added to the graveyard around 1992. They're just bigger, nastier goblins. They're often killed at birth in goblin societies, so they don't grow up and tyrannize over them. The only reason hobgoblins don't rule over the goblins is because there's just too few of them. Kobolds are the runts of goblin society. That's why kobolds and goblins act so much alike. That's one of those things that was true, and there's no good reason it would have stopped being true, but almost no one is aware of it now. The Play.net artist's depiction of kobolds is rodent-like. That's wrong. It doesn't actually say that when you look at them. Kobolds also get their description from Rolemaster. Creatures from the Ice Age are generally based on the descriptions in the source books, though the described verb didn't exist until roughly the beginning of 1993. It stands out when the creature descriptions deviate from the books, but they could have been tampered with later or written after the fact. There have been periods where creatures did not have described verbs descriptions until years after they were created. There are even a few creatures which have existed for decades that still don't have descriptions. So you have to be careful with reading things into the described verb. The death dirges are a good example of such a deviation. Dirges are depressed undead bards who sing dirges, funeral dirges. These dirges look like angry soldiers, and even in 1990 they wore visored helms. I'll talk about that more in a later video. The revenants are suicides, usually found with the blade they use to kill themselves. They're driven to destroy the rest of the living. These ones instead have their flesh all torn up as though someone else brutally tortured them to death. This is essentially the exact opposite of what a revenant is supposed to be in Rolemaster, though I do not know if they always had that description. There used to be blood beasts in the graveyard. Those were moved to Cladesburn Castle and eventually were removed entirely. I do not have a gemstone description of them. In Rolemaster, they are covered in blood, having been created from a mortal dying an extremely bloody death. That, of course, is similar to how the Revenants are misdescribed in Gemstone, so that's interesting. Whenever I come across a curiosity like that where some further relation might exist, I refer to it as circling it and drawing a question mark over it, because there might be something more to it, but I can't know if that's reading too much into it or not. Blood beasts in Rolemaster cause blood to stream to them from open wounds and cause wounds to bleed at higher rates. Double rate, I believe. When the blood hits the blood beast, it transfers the hit points to the blood beast, and people have to make a warding roll on revulsion or suffer a penalty to their actions. Blood beasts are reviled because they have a stronger hunger for blood than vampires. but they're intelligent and have lesser undead fight for them to help inflict wounds. That's what's true in Rolemaster, in the Creatures and Treasures 2 book from 1989. They didn't do all of those fancy things in Gemstone. The Blood Beast in Gemstone instead flung corrosive blood at targets which burned them. Those were probably in the general vicinity of the bog. They were level 7. By the way, Blood Beasts, Dirges, Ghoul Kings, and Shadow Assassins all come from Rolemaster's Creatures and Treasures 2 from 1989. They're not in the Shadow Rolemaster Atlas Inhabitant's Guide from 1989. The ghouls, lesser mummies, skeletons, and barrow wights are in the Master Atlas, but those originally come from Creatures and Treasures 1 from 1985. The Revenants and Phantoms come from Creatures and Treasures 1, but not the Inhabitant's Guide, and the dangerous plants I've talked about are in both. Bone Golems were originally in the crypt, at least until late 1991. They weren't there anymore by 1992. Bone Golems come from Creatures and Treasures 2. They're not in the Inhabitant's Guide either. I'm mentioning this because it shows what books must have been used by the creators. But Bander constructed the burial mound using golems. He implicitly made bone golems out of fallen soldiers. Bone golems are supposed to be very rare. Most necromancers do not know how to work bone that well. The melted wax-like throne of human ivory underground speaks to that point with Bander's abilities. Bone golems are less mindless than other golems. They do not need to be instructed to kill the living. They'll just do it on sight or when they sense them. Undead don't need to be able to see things. They often don't have eyes. They can sense life force. Golems in Rolemaster are artificial constructs imbued with an animating spirit. Undead spirits make for undead golems. Golems are supposed to be like solid statues made specifically out of a single material. Constructs in general can be more complex, but golems are not supposed to be complex. The original description of bone golems was based on the Rolemaster one, but the way they look and act now is different and fancier. Wights are supposed to be undead nobles. Mummies perhaps ought to be, but their description in Rolemaster is that they guard necropolises and to attack grave robbers. However, wights in Rolemaster are more like Nazgul, invisible ring wraiths. Even before the described verb existed, wights were described as sadistically sinking their claws into corpses, and they are corporeal undead instead of non-corporeal. The wights are written in a way that implies they are cannibals. And the ghouls are described that way too. That's consistent with the deep underground area, which is cannibalism themed, with the banquet hall and larder. White Lords are now Arc Wights, and Tomb Wights were Barrow Wights, which were, of course, in the Barrow Mound. Shadow Assassins used to exist down there in the deep underground area, though things changed around sometimes. There are times in the newsletters where people say they've never seen a White Lord down there. Well, I have a log of the throne room level from 1995 where there were nothing but White Lords. Those ones in the mid-level wore half plate, and the ones further down in the frozen level wore leather. Which of course means the ones deeper down in the frozen part were a lot less likely to have spell hindrance if they casted Boil Earth. It's at least a little ironic. The Shadow Assassins would go invisible, and the room painting suggests a presence in one spot. Supposedly they would call out your name in a mocking voice from invisibility. I've never seen a log of them. They would cast weapon fire. Shadow Assassins are the dead spirits of assassins and are conjured, not made by necromancers, and they'll relentlessly hunt down the target forever until it kills them. Shadow Assassins always have piercing yellow eyes, and they discorporate after accomplishing their mission. They are not supposed to be guardians bound in place like this forever, so that's another backwards point, and they probably relate to Bander's shadowy network. Moving back to the crypt, we see that it is lit with a material called Anver, which fell through the cracks in the de-ice. It only exists in a few places, here in the crypt and wizard private workshops like Tedra's and Odd's workshops. Anver was originally called Yark, as you can see. It is a mineral that absorbs raw essence and radiates light. It might be symbolic of the unlife which wants to consume and destroy all of existence. This cracked urn is really old, whether or not it was always there, but the ossuary is more recent. I want to say the ossuary was there when I came back at one point in 2007, but was not there yet by the end of GemStone III. I'm not 100% sure. Through the archway is a sarcophagus. This is a fake in that you're supposed to think it's Spander, but it's not. Spander is really deep underground, frozen in a block of ice, a sarcophagus of his own devising, as the story says. Behind the sarcophagus is the expansion area that isn't relevant to us, related to Serenity, the town undertaker. My script is converting human into common man here, but I do not know if the couple of instances of human in the graveyard were in the original. In the scroll room is the full-type manuscript originally made of chalk, which in Shadow World is used to make almost indestructible pages. In later editions to the Master Atlas, this is done by the Loremasters for their most important books. But in the first edition of the Master Atlas from 1989, it is a Lords of Essence method, which is a good example of why you have to use books of the right time period. Otherwise, you'll read anachronisms into things. That implies the manuscript belonged to Kadena herself, or at least one of her Lord of Essence followers. It's probably what the story refers to as a holy relic. The insignia of Kadena is undefined. Most gods and so on did not have defined symbols in Shadow World. There's a lot more to say about this room, but I will do that in later videos. In the eastern room is the false door that lets you into the underground parts of the graveyard. This used to be a puzzle you could actually figure out. The Windak beads, now Modwer beads, are the cult rosaries. Over 20 years ago, someone posted on the forums what this used to look like. Unfortunately, I don't have a saved copy of it, just a memory of roughly what it said. It could have been the tablet that was different, but I think it was the beads. It had more text which explicitly said something about the theocracy and the cultists having chanted Kadena Throck Farok in their devotions. Most people don't know this, but there's a poem written on the ceiling in this room. Arch to gate, northeast to fate, his words you speak, stone walls negate. The whole graveyard in terms of its original parts is on a southwest to northeast axis. In this poem that is stated explicitly. You would say Kadena Throck Farok and evaporate into a fine mist. When people say it in the room, you don't hear it. This phrase was changed to Shadow Bind My Soul around 1996. I have a log of Sylvian saying he spoke to a hooded figure one night who changed it, as the cult no longer uses the original chant or something to that effect. But I asked Sylvian about it 15 years later, and go figure, he doesn't recall any of that. However, that went down in 1996. With people learning the new phrase, I would say this doesn't count as a puzzle anymore. There's no conceivable way to figure it out. You have to look it up or be told the answer. Again, there's a lot more to say about this room in future videos. Over in the burial mound is a battlefield throne that's inlaid with Bellicorn ivory. This is another overlooked ice term. Bellicorn are huge sea monsters that are occasional visitors to Cladesborough Bay. They resemble lizards stuffed in turtle shells with scales, and they have long, sharp fangs. They overturn ships as large as 30 feet, and then they slash open the survivors to bloody the water. Then they eat up everything that comes to scavenge on the dead. They will also come on land with their flippers and assault coastal settlements if they don't have enough to eat at sea. Bellicorn is probably based on the Seal Tang words for noisy and dagger. This would be referencing their loud bellowing and sharp fangs. The burial mound is shaped like the hull of an overturned warship. The room painting is actually quite explicit about that, so having the Bellicorn ivory there is somewhat ironic. By the entrance to the burial mound is a dug-up dirt pile with an opening behind it. When you look at the room painting of the sloped tunnel, it is clear that someone dug their way up from underground. In the early California editions, the deep underground section does not get mentioned. It might not have been released until later in 1990. It's hard to tell. When you consider the original layout of the graveyard, this tunnel was the only way in or out. Shadow Valley was not there yet, and the albino tomb spider area did not exist. There's a huge pile of bodies at the bottom. These are implicitly people who got trapped down there with no way out. There are a couple of ways this might have happened, though there's no way to be certain. First, the scroll room is unplundered, so there might be a curse that transports you down there if you try to steal things, specifically forbidden dark knowledge. The other possibility is the knocked over dolmen on the surface next to the burial mound. Trilithons are Lord of Essence style portals, so are spoken word invocations like the false door in the crypt. It's possible Bander used that as a portal to transport in the granite, and before it fell down, Tomb Raiders would walk through it and get stuck in the deep underground section. There's more to be said, of course, about these things in the later videos. Something very subtle about this is that Bander's grand design seems to have involved him knowing or planning how things would happen later. He would have built the graveyard gate, for example, knowing the bronze and iron would eventually corrode, forming different colors, making it look like the gate is burning. He would have made the Ghoul Kings, knowing there would eventually be grave robbers, who would then be turned into ghouls and made part of the graveyard. The ghouls need to sleep in the muck of swamps, and the bog eventually formed from fallen trees. He would have known grave robbers would get trapped underground, then try to climb out, making a big pile of bodies in that dead end, where the shadow assassins would kill them, and the undead would be able to feast on them in the banquet hall or leave offerings to Bander. There's also the long-forgotten script on the tombs in the bog. This is just as old as the writing you can actually read in the graveyard, by the obelisk with Kestrel's sons, for example, in the crypt and inside the burial mound. This could be an oversight, or the room might have been tampered with for the Order of Vault task, but it is an interesting inconsistency for modern language and ancient language to coexist in the same place when it's supposed to be from the same time period, 6,000 years ago. In the Order of Vault tasks, Rain Calfor is buried there in the bog, which now says Roan Wennemer, playing into the idea that unsavory locals bury their dead in the necropolis at the end of the legends. There are also graves for base descendants of the family near the bog. This Order of Volm task, of course, contradicts the lore of Roan Wennemer riding off and never being seen again, which was not written until later. Something I'll point out with respect to the grand design is that Bander built its sections in 3 distinct styles. The crypt is an Egyptian-style mausoleum, what would be called a mastaba. The burial mound is a burial mound like you would find in the British Isles, though other aspects of it, as I will argue later, are Viking-themed. And the deep underground section is a mocking imitation of a medieval manor or castle. This is something that has to be figured out by speculative reasoning. It's something at the allegorical level of interpretation. These styles are not referring to places or times in the Shadow World setting, notwithstanding anything in Shadow World that was inspired by those things. But it's enough for now to recognize the imagery. In the last video, I will be looking at what it would mean to take those parallels literally. I will also point out now that there are points of commonality between the upper coastal cliffs area and the graveyard. That is the part that with the cemetery and the ruined underground stronghold, which has a shrine of Chlysis, now known as Lukos, from 1991. This is probably related to the point in the story where Bander crushed the dark cults to replace them with his own dark cult, though the coastal cliffs more generally is probably related to the ice crawl, which are now called the Krolven. The Krall raided and plundered the coastline after the fall of Kelburn 2 centuries ago. Then they established their settlement on the island now called Glauvelm, but originally they were from further north. Something else that is very subtle and obscure about the original graveyard are the blind spot rooms. These no longer work, but for at least a decade after it was created, there were spots in the graveyard that were effectively unpresenced. If you cast a locate spell on someone and they were in one of them, it wouldn't work. You would also not be able to fog to them, and gold rings would not work in those rooms. There have been enough changes to how locate and teleportation works over the years that however this worked under the hood is now defunct. Back around 2001 or so, I had decided on a cleric of Charl help me test the surface of the graveyard for these rooms. One of them was in the southwest corner of the crypt, that is one room northwest from the graveyard gate. The other one we found was in the center of the infinity symbol formed by the paths around the crypt and the burial mound. the room with the room painting about the long-buried secrets. If I recall correctly, the room on the northeast side of the burial mound was not one of them, even though it would have fit a pattern of the southwest and northeast axis. This is something worth keeping in mind because these could have meant something, and this was already a decade later. There could have been others that by then were missing for whatever reason. One last point of implicit things you would perceive if you were actually physically in the graveyard and walking around. Space is warped in the graveyard. It is all wrong. Everything is backwards. This is obvious with the mazes, which we don't really even think about, going to the southwest corner and ending up in the southeast corner and so on. The graveyard has 4 mazes, but they're not just mazes. Hedge mazes are mazes. These are warped spaces where you move in impossible directions. But it isn't just the mazes. It's also in the room painting, and it was probably intentional. One spot where it happens is on top of the burial mound. You see the crypt to the southeast. The crypt isn't to the southeast. The crypt is southwest of the burial mound. You even reach that room from the northeast side of the burial mound. Recall what I said earlier about the crypt's roof. Shadows surround the crypt on all sides. That isn't possible unless it's a magical effect, or space is somehow messed up. Another place where it happens is deep underground. The throne room level is the underbarrel, the frozen level is the undercrypt. However, the burial mound is on the northeast end of the graveyard, and the crypt is on the southwest end. You have to travel northeast from the underbarrel to reach the undercrypt. So, you're walking northeast, but you're actually moving backwards. Again, that could be an oversight, but I don't think it is. So that concludes the basic cursory walkthrough of the graveyard. As you can see, there are a lot of details in plain sight that have additional meaning, provided you have the books they are referencing. This is the context or paleo-history of the fixed elements of the graveyard for the Shadow World setting. There are deeper considerations in some crypto-history, including trying to reconcile the off-canon stuff about Empress Kadena. The next video will explore this world logic more deeply, but I'm skeptical that the world setting matters very deeply. The 4th video will be about death in Gemstone, which, as you will see, is somewhat off-canon itself for Shadow World, and I believe it is very relevant to the graveyard on a symbolic level. Then we will talk about allegory and the broader grand design of the graveyard after those videos. Thank you for watching through this second installment in my graveyard exploration series. Hopefully you have learned something worth knowing.